Dominic Vale had one rule that never failed him. Money never lies about who a person really is. So, on a Friday night in his glass tower above Lake Michigan, he laid 4 obsidian black cards on the table and told 4 women the same 6 words: "Spend it, and show me who you are." 3 of the women were the sharpest, most dangerous players in Chicago's underworld. The 4th was the maid nobody at that table had ever bothered to learn the name of. 96 hours later, one of those women had bought penthouses, politicians, and a private army. The maid hadn't bought a single thing she could wear. She'd bought the one document that could either save Dominic Vale's empire or bury him for a murder he never committed. This is the story of the woman everyone in that room underestimated, and the receipt that changed everything. 4 days earlier, the 38th floor of Vale Tower smelled like cedar smoke and old money. Dominic sat at the head of a black granite table, flanked by the 3 women who'd spent a decade circling his empire like it was a crown waiting to be claimed. Celine Okafor ran a private security empire that armed half the syndicates north of the Mason-Dixon, and carried herself like a woman who'd never once needed anyone's permission. Ingrid Solberg had a Rolodex that reached from the county assessor's office to the governor's mansion, and a smile she used the way other people used a scalpel. Talia Voss could move $100 million through 11 countries before breakfast, and rarely looked up from her phone long enough to remember anyone else was in the room. At the far end of the room, near the window, stood Emmett Cross, the family's longtime attorney and the only man who'd been with Dominic longer than the furniture. He held a scotch he wasn't drinking, watching the room with a stillness that no one else thought to question. Dominic had built this test 20 minutes before the women arrived, on an impulse he hadn't examined too closely. He'd spent a decade surrounded by people who only knew how to take from him, and some restless part of his mind wanted to see what happened if real money landed in the hands of someone who'd never once been given anything at all. Dominic set 3 matte black cards on the table, one in front of each woman. Vale Capital private accounts, no limit, 96 hours. Whoever proves they bring the most value to this family becomes my wife. Celine's mouth curved. Value meaning what exactly? Bodies or balance sheets? I'm not defining it for you, Dominic said. That's the test. Talia already had her phone out under the table, rooting numbers before he'd finished the sentence. It was Ingrid who noticed the 4th card still sitting in his palm. There are 4, she said. Who's missing? Dominic looked down at it like he'd forgotten he was holding it. Across the room, half hidden behind a rolling service cart, a curvy woman in a black and white uniform was clearing the last of the appetizer plates, dark hair pulled into a thick braid, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd spent years being talked over and never once asked her name. Marisol, Dominic said. The plate in her hand nearly slipped. Yes, Mr. Vale? Come here. Cross set his scotch down for the first time all evening. Dominic, is that really necessary? He said, smooth as ever, though something underneath it had gone tight. Dominic didn't look at him. Sit down, Emmett. The room went still. Celine laughed out loud. Marisol crossed the marble floor and stopped in front of the table, where 3 of the city's most powerful women stared at her like she'd wandered in from the wrong building. Dominic held out the 4th card. Take it. Sir, I really don't. It isn't a request. She folds your laundry, Talia said, not bothering to lower her voice. What's she going to buy, extra bleach? She's going to embarrass herself just by trying, Ingrid added, the way you'd talk about a child who'd wandered onto a stage. Marisol's fingers closed around the card. It was colder than she expected, and heavier. She didn't argue again. She nodded, tucked it into her apron pocket, and walked back to her cart without looking at any of them. Nobody in that room noticed the flicker behind her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. The clock started at midnight. Dominic retreated to his private office, where a wall of monitors tracked every swipe against all 4 accounts. Celine moved first, $6.2 million for a controlling stake in Sentry Core Solutions, a private security firm with contracts across 4 states. Then $2.1 million for a fleet of armored SUVs. Then $900,000 in licensed hardware routed through a Wyoming shell. By morning, she'd built herself a small private army and a board seat to match. Ingrid followed with $4 million for a controlling interest in a riverboat casino license pending before the state gaming board. $1.5 million split between 2 state senators and a zoning chair, and $700,000 for a stake in a local news affiliate. Talia moved fastest of all, $9 million into an offshore reinsurance vehicle, $3.4 million buying distressed debt off a rival cruise front companies, and $1.2 million retaining a forensic accounting firm called Ledger & Pine. 3 fortunes in motion. The fourth account showed nothing. Not one swipe, not $1, all through Saturday morning. By Saturday night, Dominic caught himself checking Marisol's balance more than the other 3 combined. It wasn't rational. Celine had assembled him a small private army in under a day. Ingrid had bought him seats in rooms he didn't currently sit in. Talia had already turned a rival crew's own debt into a leash around their neck. Any other year, any one of the 3 would have been an easy answer, but he kept picturing the way Marisol's fingers had closed around a card she clearly hadn't wanted, and the flicker behind her eyes he'd apparently never once bothered to notice in 4 years of walking past her. Across the city, in a 3rd-floor walk-up in Pilsen, Marisol sat at her kitchen table with the card in front of her, untouched for a very different reason than fear. She'd been waiting for something like it for 9 years. Her father, Rafael Reyes, had kept the books for the Vail docks for over a decade before he was arrested for the murder of a rival's courier, a man named Danny Ferris, on ballistics evidence that led conveniently back to Rafael's warehouse keys. Emmett Cross had handled the case personally and promised the family it was a formality. The real killer never surfaced. Rafael got 25 years, and 3 months ago a prison doctor told him his heart wouldn't survive the next 5. Marisol had taken the maid job specifically to get inside Vail Tower, not to hurt Dominic but to learn the house, to catch the unguarded calls and the careless conversations, and to find out who had really built the case against her father. For 4 years she'd said nothing and collected everything, waiting for the moment she'd finally have the resources to move faster than the people burying the truth. She'd visited him the Sunday before, same as every week, watching him grip the visitation phone with hands that shook now, even when he wasn't nervous. He'd told her not to waste her life chasing doors that didn't open twice. She'd smiled, told him she loved him, and said nothing about the 4 days she was about to spend proving him wrong. Dominic had just handed her that moment without meaning to. She picked up her phone and called the one man in Chicago who still owed her a favor worth cashing in. Wendell Ochoa had worked Rafael's case as a rookie detective and never stopped believing they'd gotten it wrong. When Marisol wired him $24,000 before 9 the next morning, he didn't ask where it came from. He just started making calls. By Saturday afternoon, she'd paid $180,000 to an independent forensic examiner to rerun the original ballistics against the modern database, and $2.4 million to quietly buy a shuttered county records annex in Bridgeport, the same building where 9-year-old sealed case files still sat in unclaimed storage. She wasn't buying a fortress. She was buying the one room in Chicago that still held the paper trail no one was supposed to find. By Sunday morning, someone noticed. 2 men she didn't recognize were waiting outside her building, asking polite questions about a records annex she'd apparently just purchased. She didn't wait to find out who'd sent them. 3 blocks later, a black Suburban pulled alongside her, and a man in a gray coat told her to get in and stop wasting everyone's time. "Whoever's paying you," he added, leaning toward the open window, "doesn't understand what they just bought." Marisol kept walking. 2 operators from Bishop Tactical, the protection detail she'd retained an hour earlier for exactly this reason, boxed the Suburban in before he could say another word. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody needed to. After a few seconds that felt much longer, the Suburban reversed and disappeared around the corner like it had never been there. She recognized the driver's tattoo before he pulled away, a design she'd seen years ago on men who used to wait outside her father's warehouse on payday. Whoever had sent them wasn't a stranger to the Reyes name. Her hands were still shaking 20 minutes later, but for the first time since she'd taken the card, she understood that whoever was burying the truth about her father was very much awake and very much watching her. She didn't call Dominic. She didn't call anyone but Wendell, and the only thing she told him was to move faster. Saturday night, Dominic tried the cell number on her employment file, unsure why he bothered. It rang 4 times and dropped to a generic voicemail greeting. He didn't leave a message. He told himself it didn't matter. By Sunday night, his tablet had gone quiet on 3 accounts, and violent on the 4th. Card 4, Marisol, $410,000, retainer, paralegal services, U.S. Attorney's Office, Northern District. Card 4, Marisol, $17.1 million, hostile acquisition, Cross and Whitfield Holdings. Dominic sat up so fast he knocked his glass off the desk. Cross and Whitfield was Emmett's firm. Nobody bought equity in a sitting consigliary's practice unless they meant to strip him of it. Card 4, Marisol, $3 million, retainer, Bishop Tactical, personal protection services. Card 4, Marisol, $22.4 million, escrow deposit, sealed federal filing, Northern District. The numbers kept climbing until his maid had moved more money in 6 hours than the other 3 women had moved in 3 days combined, and every dollar of it pointed at the same man. Dominic stood at the window overlooking the lake for a long time after the last alert came through, turning the tablet over in his hands like it might explain itself if he held it long enough. 20 years in this business had taught him to trust the ledger over the person. The ledger was telling him his maid had just declared war on his own consigliere, and he had no idea yet whether that made her the most dangerous person in the building or the only one worth trusting inside it. At 11:40 p.m., 20 minutes before the deadline, the private elevator opened, and Emmett Cross walked in first, summoned an hour earlier for what he'd been told was a routine review of the firm's retainer. He was still loosening his tie when the second set of doors opened behind him. Marisol stepped out in a charcoal wool coat that fit like it had been made for someone who never once ducked her head in a room. 2 Bishop operators flanked her, calm and unarmed inside the building, but close enough to matter. In her hand was a single sealed envelope. Marisol. Dominic's voice came out lower than he intended. "What is this?" "This," she said, holding the envelope without opening it, "is the reason your consigliere has spent 3 weeks trying to hand a federal prosecutor a murder charge with your name on it." Cross went very still. He recovered fast, the way men do after 30 years of talking juries out of the truth. "Dominic, I don't know what fantasy she's built, but I'd remind everyone she cleans your bathroom for a living." "I used to," Marisol said. 4 years. Long enough to learn which calls you took in the guest bathroom because you thought the running water covered your voice." She set the envelope on the bar, still sealed. 9 years ago, my father, Rafael Reyes, kept your books. He spent 9 years in Stateville for a murder he didn't commit, based on ballistics evidence Emmett delivered to the prosecutor personally. He has maybe 5 months left with the heart he has. "That case closed a decade ago," Cross said, too fast. Dominic turned to him slowly. "Emmett, look at me and tell me she's lying." Cross opened his mouth. Nothing came out. It closed because the lab that processed the evidence, Corland Forensic Solutions, was quietly owned through a shell your firm controlled. I know because I paid $180,000 to have it rerun. It doesn't match the weapon my father supposedly used. It matches a gun that was never entered into evidence at all. She turned to Dominic. 3 weeks ago, Emmett went back to Corland and ordered a second fabricated report. This one placing your prints on a weapon tied to the murder of a federal witness named Priest Calloway. He's been sitting on it, waiting for his cooperation deal to finalize. Hand them a case against you for immunity on the tax charges he's been dodging since 2019, disappear into witness protection, and let this family collapse without ever answering for what he did to my father, or to you. Dominic's jaw tightened. And the $17 million into his firm? His partnership agreement requires unanimous consent from majority equity holders before any partner enters a cooperation deal using firm resources. I own 61% as of Friday. His deal was never valid to begin with. Cross's face had gone the color of the marble under his feet. He looked at Dominic, then at Marisol, then at the 2 calm men flanking her, and understood in the space of a breath that every door in the room had just closed. His hand moved toward his jacket. Dominic saw it a half-second before it happened, the flicker of a man who understood he had nothing left to lose. Cross cleared his jacket with a pistol he'd carried for 30 years and never once needed inside these walls. He didn't get it level before a bishop operator had him face down on the marble, the gun skidding across the floor and stopping at Marisol's feet. She didn't flinch. She picked it up, unloaded it with the flat calm of someone who'd handled worse things in worse kitchens, and set it beside the envelope. At exactly midnight, the elevator chimed again. This time it wasn't the three women. Two agents from the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility stepped out, badges raised, a federal marshal a step behind them. Marisol had filed a formal complaint 3 days earlier, not through anything the Vail organization controlled, but through Wendell's old contacts and a paralegal she'd paid to walk the paperwork through by hand. Evidence fabrication by an attorney under an active federal cooperation agreement, backed by an independent forensic report and property records tying the lab straight to his firm. The moment that complaint reached a supervisor's desk, Emmett Cross stopped being a valuable witness and became a defendant. Everything he'd been holding over Dominic was now poisoned fruit, inadmissible, radioactive to any prosecutor smart enough to read a docket. Nobody had to bury him. The government he'd been about to run to did it for them, in handcuffs, in front of the one family he'd spent 30 years protecting and betraying in equal measure. 30 seconds after the marshals stepped back into the elevator with Cross between them, the doors opened one final time. Celine, Ingrid, and Talia walked in laughing, dressed for a celebration that no longer existed, each expecting to hear her own name. They stopped cold at an unloaded pistol on the bar, a scatter of federal business cards, and Marisol standing at the center of the room like she'd always belonged there. "What happened here?" Ingrid asked, her voice climbing. "Value happened," Dominic said quietly, not taking his eyes off Marisol. "Tell them." She didn't gloat. She laid it out the way she'd laid out everything else. "Celine, your $6 million bought a controlling stake in Sentry Corps. What you didn't know is that its silent majority investor is a holding company tied to the Draganov Bratva. You didn't build Dominic a private army. You handed his rivals a legal seat inside his own security." Celine's composure cracked for the first time all weekend. "Ingrid, your casino license is real and valuable, except the gaming board chair you bribed reports to a zoning commissioner who happens to be Emmett's brother-in-law. Every filing you made this weekend has his signature buried in it somewhere. You built a business Dominic can't touch until that relationship gets investigated." Ingrid's mouth opened and nothing came out. "Talia, your forensic retainer went to Ledger and Pine, the same firm Emmett has used for 11 years to launder his payments to Corland. You didn't hire an independent auditor. You refunded his slush fund." "That's not possible," Talia said, but her voice had lost its usual certainty, already running the numbers again in her head and not liking where they landed. "Check the wire records," Marisol said. "I did." The three of them stood there, stripped of every advantage they'd walked in with, saying nothing at all. "Leave the cards on the bar," Dominic said. "All three of you are done in this city." They didn't argue. The elevator doors closed on the last of their composure, and Vail Tower went quiet for the first time in 4 days. Dominic turned to Marisol. For the first time in 4 years of walking past her in his own home, he actually looked at her, not as staff, not as a contestant, but as the only person in the building who'd ever told him the whole truth without being asked twice. "You knew Cross was building a case against me," he said. "You could have taken the card, disappeared, and let it all collapse without you. Why stay?" "Because collapsing wasn't going to clear my father's name," Marisol said. "I needed you standing, alive, powerful, and in my debt. A dead Don doesn't sign anything." For a moment, the practiced steadiness in her voice slipped, just enough for him to see underneath it. 4 years of being stepped over, of watching a system decide her father's guilt before it ever asked a real question. Then it folded itself back into the same composure that had carried her through the entire weekend. It wasn't romantic. It was honest, and it landed harder than romance would have. "What do you want?" Dominic asked. "For saving my life and burying my consigliere in the same weekend. I want the motion to vacate my father's conviction to go through without your organization's fingerprints anywhere near it, so it holds up in daylight. I want you to make sure no one in this city looks at Rafael Reyes sideways again as long as he lives." and I want a seat at whatever table replaces Emmett's, not out of gratitude, but because I've already proven I'm better at protecting this family than the man who spent 30 years pretending to." Dominic studied her. Every instinct that had kept him alive for 2 decades told him a man in his position didn't hand real power to someone who now knew exactly how exposed he'd been. That the safer move, the move Emmett himself would have advised a year ago, was to thank her quietly and make sure she never got close enough to use what she knew. But he'd spent a decade collecting people who told him what he wanted to hear, and precisely none of them would have spent a weekend and a fortune digging a truth out of the ground for someone who'd never once done anything to earn it. Those old instincts had just gotten outplayed by every measure that actually mattered. "Done," he said. "All of it." He reached into his jacket and produced a small black box he'd had made weeks earlier, before any of this began, when he still believed the answer would come from a woman who looked like the ones who'd just left. Inside sat a wide platinum band set with a single dark sapphire instead of a diamond, deliberately, quietly different from anything the other 3 would have chosen for themselves. "I told you whoever brought the most value to this family would stand beside me," Dominic said. "I didn't know yet what value actually looked like." Marisol looked at the ring, then at him. "If I wear that, I'm not decoration. I run intelligence. I see every ledger, every deal, every name that comes through that door before it reaches you." "I wasn't going to offer you anything less," he said. "You'd have found a way to take it anyway." For the first time all weekend, she let herself smile. Not the careful, practiced smile she'd worn for 4 years of clearing plates and lowering her eyes, but something unguarded, something that belonged entirely to her. 6 weeks later, a Cook County judge vacated Rafael Reyes's conviction in a hearing that took 11 minutes and made the front page of 3 newspapers. Rafael walked out of Stateville 61 pounds lighter than the day he went in, met on the courthouse steps by a daughter he barely recognized in a tailored charcoal coat, flanked by men who were already calling her Mrs. Vale before the wedding had even happened. Emmett Cross was indicted 8 months later on federal obstruction and evidence tampering charges, the cooperation deal that was supposed to save him buried under the weight of the very case he'd fabricated. Celine, Ingrid, and Talia never set foot in Chicago again. Word traveled fast in rooms that used to return their calls, and none of those rooms wanted to be associated with 3 women who'd been outplayed by a maid. Marisol never lost the weight everyone once assumed she should be ashamed of, and she stopped explaining herself to anyone who brought it up. She sat in on every major decision the Vale organization made from that point forward, and more than a few people who'd once mistaken her for furniture learned to read the room before they said anything within 50 feet of her. On the day of the wedding, Rafael Reyes walked his daughter down a narrow aisle in a garden overlooking the same lake Dominic could see from his office window, strong enough by then to do it without a cane. Nobody in that room mistook Marisol for the help. Nobody would again. Dominic Vale had given 4 women unlimited black cards to find out who deserved to stand beside him. 3 of them bought power they didn't understand. His maid bought her father's life back, exposed the man who'd spent 30 years betraying them both, and walked out with an empire that finally saw her clearly. If Marisol's 4 days of quiet, ruthless brilliance had you holding your breath, hit like before you go. Subscribe for more stories about the ones everyone underestimates until it's far too late. And tell us in the comments what you'd have bought with an unlimited card and 96 hours.